Hello and welcome to episode 281 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert, as always, Damien Fay and me, Andy Leakes. Damien, how are you doing?
Well, I'm all right, Andy. It's you I'm worried about.
Why is that?
Because, well, I think by the time this podcast goes out, Watford are either relegated or they've managed the great escape. But
distant memory for me already. Yeah, we don't want to bring that up because that's just brought up bad memories. It was a really bad.
You were in a really positive mood, actually. I apologise for that because you were in such a positive mood. Andy was just telling me, weren't you, Andy, about what you've done this year in terms of money and finance, which you're particularly proud of.
Yeah, I was never particularly good with money, and over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, I sort of took it upon myself to attack one major area of finances. So one year it may have been like, I've got to get the credit card sorted. So this year is the year of cashback for me because I kept hearing about it. Obviously, working at Money to Massive, we write about these things as well. And I just thought, I've never bothered to do it. It seems like such a small amount of money to get back on the, and such a lot of effort. But I thought, no, I'm going to do it. And so I got myself an Amex card this year, a cashback Amex card. And I signed up to Quidco and Top Cashback. And crucially, actually, I didn't change my spending habits at all. So basically, I do the same thing that I've always done, but I just am a bit more savvy about the cashback. And yeah, I was just totting things up this morning. I've managed to save almost £300 already this year. And what are we? We're only halfway through the year. That's not too bad.
The year of the cashback is going well. I took a leaf out of your book. I mentioned, I think a couple of weeks ago, I changed broadband provider and I got cash back, which is unusual for me because I don't tend to do much online shopping, but then I always forget to do the Quidco or Top Cashback, whichever site you use. But yeah, I'm impressed, Andy. So the year of the cashback is going well.
Yeah, and then you brought up Watford. Anyway, moving on. What have we got coming up on this week's show?
Well, this week I want to talk about premium bonds and national savings and investments more generally, but particularly premium bonds, because it's a topic that has become, well, I've seen a number of people discussing premium bonds in our Facebook group. There's been some news articles recently because there were plans for them to cut the generosity of premium bonds. I wanted to talk about whether premium bonds are actually worth it and how they work and who they're good for. I next want to go on to tax. Now, whether you like it or not, if you're listening to this podcast, you need to be prepared for more tax. You're going to have to pay for all these pandemic giveaways, the different schemes that have been issued by the government or put out there that are aiming to save the economy or resurrect it. And at some point, they're going to probably have to raise taxes. But there is another form of stealth tax, which I think most people are not really aware of and not focusing on, that I want to bring to their attention. And the final piece is a piece based around the emergency fund that people should build, but something they've never probably ever thought about, but also links into how to make financial decisions and, more importantly, our inability to make financial decisions in times of uncertainty.
Great. So what are we going to start with? National savings and investments, premium bonds.
It sounds good. We'll start with premium bonds. Now, national savings and investments was started in 1861, so a long time ago, and it started out as the Post Office Savings Bank. And then fast forward to 1956, they launched the premium bond. Now, premium bonds were an idea to encourage post-war savings. So after the Second World War, they wanted to encourage people to save money. And also, national savings and investments is a way for the government to effectively raise money as well. So it has the added benefit of helping the government raise money, but also to encourage savings. And originally, when National Savings and Investment was first thought up as the entity, not quite like it is now, but back in 1861, its aim was to allow the working man a means of actually saving money. Now, premium bonds are a particularly popular form of savings that allow people to invest in. So I'll give a quick recap of how they work before we go on to looking whether they're actually good value or any good. So premium bonds don't pay interest. Now, each premium bond is worth £1. So for £1, you effectively get a ticket into a lottery. That's what makes premium bonds slightly unusual and perhaps interesting to people who like a flutter. Now, you can invest a minimum of £25 or up to £50,000 per person. And what happens, each of your bonds is put into a monthly draw. and it rolls over to the next month. It's not like the National Lottery where you buy a ticket and then it's only for that particular draw. Your money is put into the draw every month, month after month. And each month there are a whole host of prizes. In fact, there's 1.25 million smaller prizes, but also two £1 million prizes. So it's a way of winning big. But your odds, which I'll come on to later, are very, very small. Now, there isn't interest paid on these premium bonds. What happens is there's a sort of a general interest rate that is 1.4% that is representative. And what it really is that equates to the amount of money that's available for the monthly prize draws. So if you were to own all the premium bonds in existence, then you would win a whole load of prizes, and that would effectively equate to an interest rate of 1.4% per annum. So for most people, which again, I'll come on to the numbers and the odds, who own premium bonds, they don't actually win that much. Now, I have some premium bonds. It's like a historical thing. I think not very small amount. I think it's about £100 worth that came about when my daughter was born, actually. And at the same time, I had £100 worth of money and put them in premium bonds to see what would happen. You have to try these things. And actually, I have won some money along the way. I did win a £25 prize once and got paid that out as cash in the post. But if you work out my rate of return, then that still means that it's below the rate of inflation. And that's the key thing about premium bonds is inflation. It kills most people who invest in them. I don't mean literally, but it kills their return, because inflation historically runs at about 2%. That's our targeted. The Bank of England is targeted to keep inflation around a 2% rate. So you already are going to be losing money, even if you were lucky enough to own all the premium bonds in existence. But because you don't, the chances are your money is going to be eaten away by inflation. Now, the positives of premium bonds include the fact they are tax-free. The money you get is tax-free. They are also 100% secure. It's because they're basically backed by the government. So if you remember that the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, which relates to UK authorised banks and building societies, protects your money up to £85,000 or £170,000 for joint accounts. Well, with premium bonds, you don't have to worry about that. In fact, anything to do with the national savings and investments products, they are all 100% backed by the government, which is why they are attractive, particularly in times of stress. Now, premium bonds have the advantage that there is no notice, there's no penalties if you want to withdraw your money. You can operate them online. You can auto reinvest your winnings if you get any. You can also gift them to children. Until fairly recently, only parents and grandparents could take them out and gift them to children, but anybody can do it now, which is quite interesting and actually makes them probably more attractive to other people. Now, of course, there are cons, there are negatives to premium bonds. Like I said, you don't earn any money on them. You just have to hope you win a prize, and you have to hope the prize you win is sufficient enough to beat the ravages of inflation. Now, you can't own joint. They have to be individually owned. Most people won't win. I tell you, the odds of a prize win are 24,500 to 1.
Wow.
So you can see your chances aren't very good. In fact, the odds of winning the £1 million prize, if you have £100, like me, in premium bonds, is 1 in 38 million. Now, I've got more chance of being struck by lightning. If you have £50,000 worth of premium bonds, then the odds drop down to 1 in 74,000. So you can see the more money you have, the better premium bonds appear to be. To emphasize that point, if you crunch the numbers around premium bonds, if you have £100 in premium bonds, then in a given year, you've got, 19 out of 20 people will win nothing. If you have £15,000 worth, then the chance of you not getting anything is 1 in basically 1,500. So you've got a good chance of winning something, and typically you'll probably win up to £200. So what this means, if you start to do the maths, the chances of you beating inflation increase the more money you have. And now, if I go back to when I used to work in the city, I always remember the incredibly wealthy lawyers would love premium bonds, not because they thought they were necessarily a great return, but because they would max out their allowances. And back then their allowance was only about £30,000. But they would max out their allowance and then their partner's allowance. And they would keep going through their families to basically use as much of their premium bond allowances as they could. If you are a high rate taxpayer, Obviously, premium bonds become attractive because you aren't paying tax on any money that you make, so the prize money, but also you've got a much greater chance of getting nearer that 1.4% or whatever the rate was back then. And that starts to look quite attractive. And the best easy access current accounts at the moment give you about 1.16% a year. Now, there are some numbers that have been crunched. Money Saving Expert did some number crunching, and they looked at the chances, the odds of you beating the best easy access savings account in 1 year based upon how many premium bonds you had, which is quite an interesting concept. So if you had £100, your chances of making enough money in prizes to beat the 1.16 interest rate you would get on the best easy access savings account is only 5%. If you have £1,000, that goes up to 39%. If you have 5,000, it starts to go up to 45%. Once you get to £30,000, then the odds start to push above 50%, so more than a toss of a coin. If you get up to like £50,000, you're looking at over 60% chance that you could earn enough interest that will beat that 1.16% best easy access savings account rate. And that's because, as I say, the total pool prize money rate is 1.4% on premium bonds. So the message becomes very clearly, premium bonds start to become very interesting the more you have in them. And if you can max out your allowances, actually, it becomes better than the toss of a coin that you could earn more money than you can in the current environment, that is, on easy access savings accounts. And of course, the rates on some of the fixed term savings accounts aren't that much better right now. But it was interesting, if you crunch those numbers, I personally hadn't quite appreciated to the full extent in this environment how good premium bonds can be for people who are incredibly wealthy. A few other things to note before we move on. You can't inherit premium bonds. You don't inherit them in their own form. What happens is they basically become cashed in and ultimately form part of the estate. So yeah, you could get the money and buy some more premium bonds if you wanted to, if you were going to inherit the money. But it's not like, say, an ISA allowance now, which a spouse can technically inherit. So it's slightly different and it's not as favourable, but you can overcome it. Also, if you want to have a regular income, then premium bonds are no good for you because, as I say, they don't pay an interest rate. If you want a guaranteed return, they're no good for you. And if you're worried about inflation, as I've mentioned, they're no good for you. What I want to finish on in this piece is to also highlight how good NS&I products are right now. So you heard me talking about the best easy access savings accounts. Now, if you've been paying any attention to savings accounts out there, you will know that they're being pulled left, right and centre. The rates have been falling. There was a lot of talk about Marcus, which was the savings bank from Goldman Sachs, had a great product. I won't say great, it wasn't even that good, but it was the best of a bad bunch. And that was pulled. As all these saving rates are being pulled because interest rates are plummeting, the Bank of England keeps cutting the interest rate and it's likely to stay lower for longer. NS&I have had to step up and they are now the best easy access savings products. They offer the best ones out there. So they offer a direct saver that gives an interest rate of 1% a year. And you can save between a minimum of £1 and £2 million with them. And of course, that interest can be rolled up. They also have something called an income bond, which is effectively easy access as well. But you have to have a minimum of £500 and a maximum of £1 million. And that interest rate is slightly higher at 1.16%. And that's the annual equivalent rate. But the money is paid out as an income stream, so it doesn't automatically compound up. So that just shows you they are already offering products that are some of the best in the market. And that's partly because the government has suddenly realised they've got to offer something. I think personally, because the Bank of England are cutting interest rates, the government also say they want to support savers, but I think it's also to do with the fact about raising money. But there were plans to cut the interest rates on premium bonds and some NS&I products, but many of them were reversed. So I don't know, that will probably happen again in the future. But of course, I mentioned about using premium bonds for children, but NS&I actually offer one of the best junior ISA savings rate at 3.25%. So the message on this part of the podcast, there are a lot of people out there who probably haven't even thought about looking at NS&I, but they are right now riding high in a lot of the savings tables. They are 100% backed by the government as well. So these are all positives. Of course, you don't have to just use NS&I products. I mean, there are other savings accounts, regular children's savings accounts out there that can pay up to 4%. Halifax has one. There are others. And of course, for savers, there is the savings allowance that we have. So for basic rate savers, that's £1,000 a year. So people have to bear that in mind as well. But have a look at premium bonds. They are definitely worth it for some people. For others, not so much.
Okay, so you mentioned earlier about a stealth tax and taxes in general. What have we got on this piece?
Okay, on this piece, it relates to the various schemes that have been pushed out by the government to help with the pandemic and help the economy recover. We are going to have to pay for that at some point. And there was a headline that came out, and basically the government is starting to look into capital gains tax. It wants to look at the capital gains tax reliefs and allowances. And obviously that got a few people nervous / excited, depends on which side of the fence you sit, if you're a journalist or you're a normal punter, about the possibility that there could be tweaks to capital gains tax to try and recoup some of the money that the government is spending on all these various support schemes. And of course, that is one thing that the government might do going forward. It's something to bear in mind. No one knows quite how they would change capital gains tax, whether they'll put it up, whether they will remove some of the reliefs out there, or indeed whether they'll do anything at all.
They always seem to go for the easy targets, the low-hanging fruit. I mean, capital gains tax seems a little too easy, doesn't it?
It does, and I think one of the reasons they might do that is because if you think there are definitely the haves and have-nots as a result of the coronavirus, so depending on which part of the population you are in, it feels like the people who already had assets and are affluent have actually benefited from a lot of what's gone on in the coronavirus world, as long as they haven't lost their jobs and as long as their income streams have been maintained and the value of their assets. In fact, the stock markets have recovered somewhat. So I think there are a lot of people who have benefited. And I think profits, basically capital gains, is effectively a tax on profit. So it's quite an easy one politically to push out there. But what I wanted to talk about was something else which links quite nicely into the previous piece about raising money in governments and how they do it. And it's effectively a stealth tax. And that stealth tax is inflation. Now, if you go back to episode 274, I talked about how to increase your wealth. And I spent a lot of time talking about inflation and the impacts of inflation, how people need to understand how it works and compounding, and then they need to therefore invest accordingly. Well, at that point, I mentioned about inflation can work as a tax, but I didn't really elaborate as to what that meant. And given the moves now by the government to start to look at ways that they can generate more revenue and effectively tax people to be able to recoup some of the losses, then it's particularly relevant to talk about inflation as a form of taxation. So to explain this, if you imagine a government can raise money by raising taxes, it can encourage people to save, as we just mentioned in the last piece as well. Obviously, raising taxes is politically difficult, and governments work in very short time frames. I mean, I don't think there's ever been a government that's thinking about 100 years' time. They're just thinking about the next 4 or 5 years and becoming re-elected. So in this environment, the government won't want to put up taxes, presumably. It will be quite difficult for some people to pay them as well. So the government is borrowing a lot of money, we know that. And the way it obviously does that is via gilt. So a gilt is effectively a loan to the UK government. So if somebody buys a gilt, invests in a gilt, they're loaning money to the UK government. So the government could go out there and borrow lots of money. If it's not going to raise money through tax, by taxing all of us, it's going to have to borrow. And one of the things that the government can do effectively in a roundabout way is buy that debt. So you know that the Bank of England has been printing money. We talk about it a lot on the podcast through quantitative easing. And one of the things that they do via quantitative easing is effectively buy gilt, buy bonds to be able to print money. I say print money in that inverted commas way because they don't literally print money, but they do it via buying things like gilts and bonds from institutions, which then have the money and it should hopefully go out into the economy. The point being is that by printing money, they are able to finance themselves. And printing money causes inflation ultimately. Now, the reason it can cause inflation, I'll come on to the fact whether it does or doesn't always. The reason it can cause inflation is if you think of the world, or let's just say the UK, and it's got a finite amount of things in it. but the amount of money isn't finite. The amount of money is increasing because the government is effectively printing money. If the amount of money chasing those fixed assets is going up, that means that the amount of money being used to buy those fixed assets will increase. That's inflation. Prices start to go up. So the government effectively can print money and borrow in that way. So it gets the money it needs to spend. It hasn't had to raise taxes. But what can start to happen is the price of things start to go up. Now, if you imagine you're sitting there with £1,000 and that £1,000 could be taxed. So the government can think, we need to raise money, we could tax you. So your £1,000 could be now 900 or whatever the amount is, 950. So you've got less spending power because you've been taxed physically. There's been a taxation. Inflation works the same way because your money, although you have £1,000, the spending power starts to reduce. If everything around you goes up in value, you've effectively been taxed because you've got less money in real terms to buy things. You can buy less stuff. So if you're a government, then the idea of printing money, which our government is effectively able to do rather than raise taxes, in certain environments works like a tax. Printing money can work like a tax. Inflation works like a tax. So the message of this piece is that people need to be more aware of this more than ever because the government is actively pursuing this route of printing money in a way. That's what's happening. The government is borrowing money. The Bank of England is buying it through printing money. Effectively, wherever you dress it up, an increase in inflation is likely to happen, which is effectively a taxation, which is stemming from the government trying to borrow more money. That's what you have to bear in mind. So going back to that podcast I mentioned, in this environment, it's important that people do start to think about investing for inflation or owning assets that can rise with inflation. So go back and listen to that podcast. And it's something I've been thinking about a lot this week and when I'm looking at my own finances as well. And one of the other things to bear in mind, which is just part of all of this, is all linked together. If you start to get inflation coming along, you get something which they call bracket creep. And that means that wages start to go up because obviously people need to be paid a bit more. Well, if the brackets for taxation on income tax don't move at the same pace, more people move into each tax bracket and therefore they end up paying more tax without the government theoretically raising tax on somebody. It's felt like you've just got a pay rise. Yeah, I'm going to have to pay more tax because I'm getting paid more, but you're still worse off theoretically. So all of this ends up being a positive for the government politically. Now, the other thing to also bear in mind is that if inflation comes along and you have a debt, then not only does the value of your money you've got in your pocket fall in real terms, it can buy less stuff. If you have a debt, that real value of that debt is falling as inflation increases over time, which is quite handy if you're a government borrowing more and more money. Because if you had let's imagine, to give people an example to understand, let's imagine your granddad had a £5,000 debt that he owed back in the 1950s. It would have been a huge sum and it stayed fixed. It didn't go up. Now, if you imagine inflation, what would that be worth today? £5,000 back then was a fortune. £5,000 today is probably a typical credit card balance. But back then you could have bought a house with that sort of money. So that shows you the impact of inflation on debt. So all of these things are kind of in the government's interest in the way. Now, I'm not saying they want to go and blast inflation through the roof. They don't have direct control of it, but they wouldn't want to because you don't want to get into the worlds of hyperinflation. That's dangerous. You can see that can completely wreck an economy. It would overheat the economy. The economy would collapse. You'd have people walking around with wheelbarrows of money for a loaf of bread. And also you have to think that after the financial crisis, inflation didn't pick up to the extent that a lot of people predicted. Inflation has still been pretty low throughout that whole period. So since 2008 all the way up until now, we've not seen a real spike in inflation. But the message really is that going forward, that's not to say that inflation won't pick up. I mean, as I say, the government doesn't have direct control of this, but the message I want people to take away is to start to think about inflation even more, because in this period of time in history, it's starting to be a little bit more relevant, particularly as we're starting to print money and QE and all those things. And that's not just in the UK, that's also globally. So inflation can be a tax under certain economic conditions.
Okay, so every time I think of inflation, I'm going to think of taxation, and I get it. That's an interesting sort of twist on it. I haven't really heard that analysis of it. So I'm going to think differently next time I hear about inflation. I mean, inflation to me is always quite a negative thing anyway. I always think, oh, things are going up.
But it's one of those things you don't really ever feel. It's not till you look back and you suddenly ponder the cost of something you bought maybe 5 years ago if you buy the same thing. Inflation is a very stealth-like thing that we never realise, and people in jobs might not get a pay rise for years, but they're actually worse off than they were. And it's a very difficult concept to understand as well, and I appreciate that.
I know it's strange, but I always look at a can of Coke and the cost of a can of Coke, because that's something as a child that I knew the price of, and it would cost me 25p. And now I see a can of Coke in the shops and it's £1. I mean, that's a huge
I remember halfpenny sweets.
Really?
I remember halfpenny sweets, yeah. So there you go. We don't get those anymore.
Right. What's the last piece?
Last piece is about uncertainty. Now, again, I've been doing a lot of thinking in the last week or two about my own finances. Now, lockdown has been brilliant for finance. It's been very difficult for a lot of people, but it's also made us all focus on personal finance and looking at the bills. Now, you said earlier, this is the year of cashback for you. For me, it's been a year of my utility bills and direct debits. I've been absolutely hammering some of those and trying to get those down and actually getting rid of services that I may have used but really didn't need, if that makes sense. So making your money go further. And one of the things we all learnt about is the importance of an emergency fund and about saving that money up, and we can use it in times when we need it, like we did during the pandemic, particularly if we're losing jobs and we're struggling. Now, there is one thing that I've never heard anybody talk about, and it's something that I was pondering, like I say, the other day, and it's about when to enter your emergency fund, when to use it, because there's something about a safety net. Psychologically, it's almost the value in it lies in it being there. And so we're told you save it up for that rainy day when there's an emergency. Getting the fire extinguisher out and using it is far scarier than the concept of having one in the cupboard.
Yeah.
And the psychology behind that, I don't think anybody talks about. And I was sitting there thinking about it personally at the point where you start to use it. There's an admission there that things are starting to go wrong, and the uncertainty that you feel in your gut. Anybody listen to it who's used their emergency fund, it's like I say, probably almost like that adrenaline when you're getting the extinguisher out. Things have gone out of control. I'm going to have to use this. You don't even know if you're going to put the fire out with the fire extinguisher. And it's the same with an emergency fund. And so what happens, there was an interesting article I was reading about the psychology of making decisions more widely. And it touched upon something to do with uncertainty. And when there is uncertainty, we find it very hard to make decisions, in particular financial decisions I'm referring to. So when there's uncertainty, even though we've got an emergency fund, we struggle with actually using it. And what tends to happen is that a lot of people will put off using their emergency fund to their detriment until things go really wrong, and they should have accessed it before. And it could be they default on things and it causes impacts on their credit reports or whatever it is. They will put it off. So what I wanted people to think about is an important task alongside building an emergency fund or building access to credit lines that will give you a couple of months breathing space. So 3 to 6 months salary or earnings, is you need to build a decision process to overcome this inertia and this inability to make a financial decision. You need to set trigger points of which you will then start to use that emergency fund. So it becomes an action rather than you putting it off, becoming an emotional thing. So it's a bit like when the fire alarm goes off, that's the point when you then call the fire brigade or get the fire extinguisher out. It's not the point when you straight away might smell a bit of smoke. What's that? It's the point where you know there's a serious problem. So it could be on an emergency fund. What you will need to do is decide it's when maybe your income falls below a certain level. Maybe it's just as simple as if you lose your job or when your partner loses a job. So sit down and work out what the trigger point is and then write it down and then stick to it, because then it becomes a point of action. And it may be you even set how much you want to start to dip into it. So it may be you don't want to get to the point where you've got to then use it all. You might just use a portion of it just to top up your earnings or whatever it is until you're at the point where you can then fill it. And then you start to set rules at which point you start to fill it back up again. These are all important because they help you make financial decisions. And it's uncertainty that we have to try and embrace. It's the one thing that makes us like rabbits in a headlight, that we start to worry and we don't do anything. Another example of how uncertainty stops people making decisions, and I've seen it a lot in the last 3-4 months, is the stock market. I've had loads of emails from people saying, either I was not in the stock market, I got cash on the sidelines now, when do I get back in? And the answer is, I don't know. And the uncertainty is what's making them not make a decision. And apart from the fact they need to make sure they've got emergency funds and they do their full financial planning like they would do, assuming that's all done, then the best bet is to start to try and drip back in, because then you're following a process that's thought out, that's logical, that has sound reasoning and evidence that if you're worried about the falling market, it's the best strategy to take. And you accept the fact you won't capture all the upside if the market rips higher, because you're only dripping in over a period of time. But it allows you to make a decision, and rather than sit on the sidelines and then basically miss out and never make a decision. Equally, if you look at things like maybe you're trying to sell a house, you need to break that down. You need to break it down into its stages. Maybe you're thinking about the stamp duty holiday. Do we need to move? Well, the first thing you need to do is instruct an estate agent to work out the value of your house. Uncertainty, we will often just sit there and not do anything. And it's something that my wife and I have been talking about. And it's even uncertainty when it comes to planning for the future. So let's say you're wanting to retire. If you don't know when you want to retire, then the chances are you're never going to do anything about it. So if you suddenly, I tell you what, it is an interesting exercise. If you said, I want to retire in 10 years, everybody listening to this podcast, they'd be sitting there thinking, well, that's going to be difficult. What would I need to do to retire in 10 years? If you just played that exercise and then maybe you extend it to 15, you started to work out the numbers and the amount of money you would need, you've got a much greater chance of making a decision and a plan about when you can retire. Look at the power of compounding. How much money would you put in? What if I cut bills here or there? And the reason I wanted to do this as a piece on the podcast wasn't just primarily about the emergency fund. That was the key part of it, because I know there's a lot of people out there accessing emergency funds, worrying about it. But it was also because for me, I had the same thought process about, well, when do I want to retire? When do I want things to happen in life? And sat down and started to crunch some numbers about it. And then when you remove that uncertainty by putting in deadlines and when you want things to happen, then suddenly, as if by magic, you start making decisions to make that more likely to happen. Even if you can't afford the full contributions to your investments and pensions, but at least you start knowing where you're going. You start to make a plan. It makes it much more likely to happen.
Okay, so that's it. We're done for this week. If you want to get in touch with Damien, you can do so. It's damien@moneytothemasses.com. Twitter is @moneytothemasses with the number 2. And of course, you can join our Facebook group if you haven't already done so. It's facebook.com/groups/moneytothemasses. Oh, and review the podcast.
Yeah, we need some more podcast reviews. We've not had any for maybe a couple of shows, so please make sure you review it. I know there's so many of you out there that we should be on probably about 2,000 reviews, even if just a portion of you were reviewing the podcast. So please do review the podcast. It makes mine and Andy's day.
Yeah, especially with Watford losing. I need a bit of a... I've brought it up again.
Someone's bound to put it in a review now.
Yeah. Right, until next time.
Until next time.